he's speaking it to his disciples. All right? So the direct audience that he is speaking to are his disciples. But we find, if you look down at chapter 16, verse 14, now the Pharisees, who were lovers of money, also heard all of these things. Okay, so in the context, Jesus had been talking to the Pharisees before. We see that going back to the start of chapter 15. He then turns to his disciples for this parable in chapter 16. Of course, he knows who is still there, who is still listening. And then we find in chapter 17, verse 11, that Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem. All right, so there is this passage, right? He's moving from one place to another, but as his manner was, teaching at every opportunity, expounding upon the mysteries of the gospel, trying to unpack and show this to those who were following him or those who were challenging him. And so we have this kind of dual audience in our context to think about chapter 16. All right, so at this point, let's read this parable together. Get the God's word in our view, our mind, and our hearts. So we'll read through chapter verse 15, chapter 16. All right, verse 1. He also said to his disciples, there was a certain rich man who had a steward, and an accusation was brought to him that this man was wasting his goods. So he called him and said to him, what is this I hear about you? Give an account of your stewardship, for you can no longer be steward. Then the steward said within himself, what shall I do? For my master is taking the stewardship away from me. I cannot dig, I am ashamed to beg. I have resolved what to do, that when I am put out of the stewardship, they may receive me into their houses. So he called every one of his master's debtors to him. And he said to the first, how much do you owe my master? And he said, 100 measures of oil. And so he said to him, take your bill and sit down quickly and write 50. Then he said to another, and how much do you owe? So he said, 100 measures of wheat. And he said to him, take your bill and write 80. So the master commended the unjust steward because he had dealt shrewdly. For the sons of this world are more shrewd in their generation than the sons of light. And I say to you, make friends for yourselves by unrighteous mammon, that when you fail, they may receive you into an everlasting home. He who is faithful in what is least is faithful also in much, and he who is unjust in what is least is unjust also in much. Therefore, if you have not been faithful in the righteous mammon, who will commit to your trust the true riches? And if you have not been faithful in what is another man's, who will give you what is your own? No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will be loyal to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. Now the Pharisees, who were lovers of money, also heard all these things, and they derided him. And he said to them, you are those who justify yourselves before men, but God knows your hearts, for what is highly esteemed among men is an abomination in the sight of God. All right, so we'll stop there. We've got our primary and our secondary audiences kind of discussed there, and so let's walk through this parable starting there at verse 1. Well, real quick before we begin, overall, okay, we're gonna talk about some of the difficult phrases and the difficult passages within this parable, but let's not miss the overall theme, right, of stewardship. All right, we're focused on a steward, somebody who is given charge over something of value, something of possessions. All right, so we can see the intent in here of driving home faithfulness, driving home the aspect that we are to be faithful stewards. If you want to make a note of 1 Corinthians chapter 4, 1 and 2, just I thought it a good passage to kind of bring that into mind. 1 Corinthians 4 says, let a man so consider us as servants of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God. Moreover, it is required in stewards that one be found faithful. All right, so here we have the parable of the unjust steward. And we see, and what we're going to talk about, this contrast of being a faithful steward, being somebody who can have trust placed into them. All right, so an overall theme, and now let's unpack that. All right, let's unpack that. First verse, speaking to his disciples. There's a couple of key words that I want us to focus on in this first verse. A certain rich man who had a steward, and an accusation was brought to him. All right? So we have this key element at the very beginning, this accusation brought to the master, okay? Speaking about the steward. And so we might ask the question, who brought the accusation? All right? We don't know. We don't know who brought to the master this accusation. There's really, kind of only a few possibilities, all right? Thinking about where the steward was, it could have been somebody who was above the steward, all right? Somebody who had maybe authority closer to the authority of the master. It could have been somebody on par with the steward, some sort of fellow manager. It could have been somebody underneath the steward, right? Some servant or tenant who was underneath the steward. But we don't know, all right? But I bring that up in terms of the accusation. There is something brought to the master, charged against the steward, whether it was coming from below or whether it was coming from above. It was somebody who saw something and reported it. All right? But then we have the next phrase. The accusation focuses on wasting. All right? That the steward was wasting his goods, wasting the master's goods. If you look back at the previous chapter, chapter 15, verse 13, we have the parable of the prodigal son. In the parable of the prodigal son, what was essentially the charge that would come to that prodigal, or about that prodigal? Okay? He wasted his inheritance. And so in verse 13 of chapter 15, you will find in many of the versions where it says wasteful living, some versions say prodigal living. It's the same Greek word that we find here in 16 verse 1. All right? So we have two passages not very far apart from one another where there's a reference, a charge to an individual in the parable about being wasteful. What is a difference maybe in this case between the prodigal son and the steward in regards to the wastefulness? Okay, wasting something that belongs to somebody else. That being the unjust steward in chapter 16. Okay, yes sir? Okay, worldly living. Interesting, right? In one, it's talked about that there is this charge of wasteful life, wasteful living, but the waste was of his own possessions, right? I mean, the prodigal son left with the possessions that were his. He asked the father, it was his inheritance, yes, but it was given to him, and then he went and wasted it. Here we have the unjust steward who is not wasting his own goods. He is wasting the goods that he is in charge of, all right? So that's the accusation brought to the master. This man was wasting the master's goods, all right? So just an interesting contrast. It seems to be, all right, seems kind of an implication that it was intentional, all right, that there was a purpose behind it in terms of it wasn't just necessarily neglect, that he had left something undone, that he hadn't taken care of something he should have. It seems like it was more of this intentional, and we'll see that played out in the following verses. So we have this wastefulness on the part of something that was entrusted to the steward, an accusation where this had been noticed, it had been seen, it was obvious in some regard, all right? So it wasn't necessarily just a hidden thing, it wasn't a private thing just between the steward and the master, it was a public thing. Seemingly, right, that the master didn't even know about it. This accusation got brought to his attention. All right, so what does the master do? Verse 2. What does that master turn around and do? All right, I learned some new information. and I called in to find out about it, right? What is this I hear about you, he asks, right? So he poses it into this question. Give an account of your stewardship, for you can no longer be steward. All right? So he calls him in. He asks him, puts him on, called to the carpet. What is this? You have to give an account of the stewardship. I want us to focus maybe on that concluding phrase, just in terms of this statement. For you can no longer be steward. All right? No longer be steward. What does that bring about? What does that imply? What does that bring into this conversation? He got fired. Okay. All right. The master? Okay. Okay. And we will see in verse 3 in just a second. Yes. It seems like the master is giving, what is this I hear about you? All right. But he's laying out very likely the accusation, right? He's bringing it out, but he's saying you have to give an account of yourself, and all of this being true, you're no longer a steward. This isn't it is what sounds to be a finality. Yes, sir. Okay, let's jump into verse 3. Mark bringing up, could it have been questionable? All right. So the steward said within himself, "What shall I do? My master is," and in the New King James, "My master is taking the stewardship away from me." All right. So if we stop right there, the question of what shall I do? What shall I do? If it had been completely false, if the accusation had been slanderous, if it had been unfounded, what could the steward have done? Okay. Make a defense? Yes. Could he have asked for what proof is there? Could he have shown, here's the proof against it? I wrote that down too. Sort of he could have defended himself. He could have brought that proof. He could have said something to challenge that situation. What shall I do? My master is taking the stewardship away from me. All right. So according to verse 8. All right. So if we just jump down real quick, according to verse 8, how is the steward described in verse 8? Okay. So it starts off, so the master commended the unjust steward. Okay, we're going to come to the commending, and we're going to come to the shrewd. That's central in this parable. But the reason it's called the unjust steward, the unrighteous steward, the dishonest manager in sort of the headlines above the chapter is because verse 8 identifies he's unjust. This is an unjust steward. Okay, so if we back up to verse 3 and this question of what shall I do? All right, he didn't defend himself. All right, which is not the human response. All right, of course we see Jesus not defending himself, but that's on purpose. That's fulfilling prophecy. He had ample evidence to defend himself. Okay. But humans, right, being challenged with something, being kicked out of your life, maybe losing all of your livelihood for something that is false, would naturally want to challenge back. So I think in this passage, right, in this section, we have the accusation early on. In the concluding aspect, he is called the unjust steward. All right? When we come to verse 3, given an opportunity to defend himself, he did not say that. He said, what shall I do? this is being taken away from me, all right? Whether the master had fully decided that in verse 1 or not, or verse 2 when he calls him in, whether he had fully decided that or not, the steward responds back that it's being taken away, all right? What is it? And the two possibilities, what are the two possibilities that he speaks of in what shall I do? Be a ditch digger or a beggar. All right, and he says, I cannot dig, I'm ashamed to beg. All right, so the two things that flash into his mind seem to imply he's about to lose all of his station, his place, his livelihood, maybe his home, right? That flashes in ditch digging and begging. All right, he says, I cannot dig. What do you think about that short statement? What could that mean? Okay. Blake. Okay. So I would say it's 3 words. I cannot dig. Could he have been physically unable? Could he have been, since he was a steward in a household, a manager, maybe he was older, maybe he had never done, possibly, but we're not sure. Was it physical? Was it mental? Was it prideful? Very possibly. When we come to the second one, is there maybe a question in the second one? I am ashamed to beg. All right. That's a shame, that's a pride, okay? There's a station, there's an aspect, okay? Now, could it have been maybe a positive sense of pride? I don't want to beg. That's not what I should do. Could it have been the opposite side, right? A sinful pride, shameful, that it's beneath me. I can't ask for somebody else's help. It could have been that too. But I think it's that last one we discussed, just from this aspect. He didn't think it was too shameful to waste his master's goods. He didn't think it was too shameful in some sort of dishonest way, maybe like Blake was saying, maybe a lazy way. Maybe he was wasteful with the goods because he was lazy with it. Maybe that's part of the wasting, maybe so. But he didn't find that to be shameful. He was engaging in it, apparently. But now he does find begging being shameful. I think that's a strange contrast in how he views and that pride. 2 Thessalonians 3 verse 10, if anyone will not work, neither shall he eat. All right, but Proverbs 12 verse 11, whoever works his land will have plenty of bread. He who follows worthless pursuits lacks sense. The next chapter in Proverbs 13 verse 4, the soul of the sluggard craves and gets nothing, while the soul of the diligent is richly supplied. All right, so he was not too proud to be dishonest, to steal in some regards, but he was too proud to ask help of someone else. But all of that said, right, he doesn't want to go down the path of ditch digging. He doesn't want to go down the path of being ashamed and of begging and feeling that sort of shame for his life. So what do we have in verse 4? All right. A key word right in the very first. I have decided. I have resolved what to do. Okay? So he is quickly moving through his options. It's not physical. It's not begging. I've got to find something, right? Again, he's not turning with, let me defend, let me bring this case, let me pull out my books, let me show where the goods are, let me bring the tenants who know me, let me expose my character to the master. He hasn't gone down that road. Instead, right, he says, I do have a resolution. So he focused on something, right? He made a decision. He chooses to do something, to be active. What does he say, though, in verse 4 about the stewardship? That when I am put out, all right? So again, he's following through with this pattern. It really wasn't necessarily a question of
am I going to be able to keep it in some way of defending myself? But he says, when I am put out of the stewardship, they may receive me into their houses. All right. Verse 5, we see who the they is, right? He called every one of his master's debtors to him. All right. So he is focused on doing something. He's going to be active. He's going to make preparations. And he turns to the tenants. All right. He turns to the tenants of his master. And he wants to be received by them when he is cast out. And I guess just a question. It seems who would engage to trust him? That goes back to